This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Ethiopia's election board due to announce results of the country's parliamentary elections. 10 years on, South Sudan's President Salva Kiir pledges to maintain peace. Haiti names interim leader as the manhunt continues for all those involved in the assassination of its president. Hello and welcome to Africa Live. As always, great to have you with us. I'm Richard Nta, live in Nairobi, and for those of you joining us from across the continent and around the globe, we thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at other stories making headlines this hour. Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation signs an agreement to acquire 20% of upcoming Dangote refinery. And Olympic organizers issue a rallying call ahead of the opening ceremony. Once again, welcome to Africa Live. So good to have you with us. Let's begin in Ethiopia, where the country's election board said on Friday it is preparing to announce the results of the country's parliamentary elections. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed hailed the June 21st vote as the country's first free and fair election after decades of repressive rule. For more on this, we are joined by CGTN's Gurum Chala. Gurum, welcome to Africa Live. Welcome to the program. Great to have you here for your analysis. Give us the very latest.
So, as you've said, the June 21st Ethiopian elections were widely accepted by the international community, and Ethiopia called it free and fair. The voter turnout was also surprisingly high, as expectations were too low. Now, the results, although delayed a little bit, are going to be announced today. The electoral board, the National Electoral Board of Ethiopia, has just announced, and we've been told also from source inside, that today around 5 or 6 o'clock Nairobi time, Ethiopia time at the same time, the general election results will be announced. And by the way, the Prosperity Party, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's party, the ruling party, has the highest expectation to win most of the seats in the parliament and also the regional states at the same time. So the results will be announced tonight, and we'll be reporting back to you when we get that information.
All right. Gurum, it has to be said that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has welcomed Ethiopia's commitment to ensuring aid workers can access the war-ravaged Tigray region. Can you give us more on those developments?
Richard, 8 months of conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia, in the Tigray regional state, left hundreds of thousands of people vulnerable to food shortages. And the conflict also made people lose their localities and go to other safer places, including crossing borders to Sudan, looking for shelter, food, and also security at the same time. As you've said, now things are calmer as the Ethiopian Defense Force withdrew themselves, as TPLF also doesn't accept this, chase them away, as they say, out of the Tigray regional state. But all in all, the commitment from the government side of, when it comes to the provision of aid is widely accepted again by the UN. As you've said, Antonio Guterres appreciated it. The Ethiopian authorities are saying that now food provision is being made from Sudan. We have seen also pictures of trucks full of food which belong to the World Food Program, crossing border and heading to the Tigray regional state. So both the government and the TPLF seem to be so much committed to the provision of food in that regional state. So far, what we know is that things are getting better by the day, and we expect next week we're going to hear also better information than this one when it comes to addressing aid to the Tigray regional state and people who need it there.
All right, Gurum Chala, many thanks. Great to get your insights. Staying in Ethiopia, the UN Security Council has backed the African Union's initiative to coordinate talks between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt to resolve a dispute over the filling of a reservoir behind the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Egypt and Sudan had asked the UN Security Council to help resolve the dispute, but Ethiopia insisted that the council had no mandate to do so. At a session on Thursday, the council threw its weight behind the AU's ongoing efforts to end the standoff. CGTN's Groom Chala once again reports.
Special Envoy
This meeting at the UN Security Council was called to openly deliberate on the sticking issues between Ethiopia, which is building the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, Egypt and Sudan. The two North African nations have raised concerns about the building of the dam and want a binding agreement governing how it will be filled. Ethiopia has insisted on its right to continue developing the dam along the Blue Nile.
And China appreciates the active role played by
members of the Security Council, China, Russia, the United States, as well as India and the United Kingdom have all said the issue of the dam must be looked at by the African Union and not by the UN Security Council.
I was rather encouraged by the statements of the Council members, who all supported and endorsed that the African Union chairman should continue and that the three countries, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan, should initiate negotiations under the auspices of the chairman of the African Union, His Excellency President Felix Tshisekedi.
Actually, Sudan demanded or requested of the UN Security Council to convene this session. It is now the second session in a row since last year to concern or addressing the status of the GAD. What we have heard there is really encouraging that this is a very important matter that is taking the interest of the world.
This is the second time the United Nations has discussed the issue of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam after a request by Egypt and Sudan. Ethiopia's Minister of Water, Irrigation and Energy, Seleshe Bekele, has however called this latest meeting unnecessary and unfortunate.
Perhaps I'm the first water minister addressing the August body on hydroelectric dam that is under scrutiny in the unprecedented and unfair manner here at Security Council. We believe, Ethiopia believes, it is an unfitting use of the time and the resources of the UN Security Council to discuss the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam. Nevertheless, I have voiced the concerns and the just causes of my country, Ethiopia. Let me reiterate that we are dealing here with a hydroelectric dam. We are not building a nuclear plant, which is not the first of its kind in Africa or in the world.
In the session, Tunisia had delivered a draft resolution demanding that the three countries reach a binding legal agreement within 6 months, as well as preventing Ethiopia from proceeding with the second filling of its mega dam. Cairo and Khartoum supported that draft resolution. However, the UNSC did not ask for any halt of Ethiopia's scheduled filling of the Girtz reservoir. In the end, the job of finding a viable solution for Ethiopia, Egypt and Sudan is now back in the hands of the African Union. Many say an African challenge deserves and can get an African solution. Groom Chala, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
South Sudan's President Salva Kiir pledged Friday he would not return the country to war in a speech marking 10 troubled years of independence. The world's newest nation declared independence from Sudan on July the 9th, 2011. Just 2 years later, it was plunged into a devastating civil war that claimed almost 400,000 lives and displaced 4 million people. Kiir has said that the current cessation of hostilities is because of a new spirit of dialogue among the parties to the 2018 peace agreement.
On my part, I assure you that I will not return you back to war again. Let us all work together to recover the lost decade and put our country back to the path of development in this new decade. We have managed to cease hostilities and maintain for nearly two years and 7 months the ceasefire under the expansive peace agreement which we signed in September 2018.
Meanwhile, South Sudan's engagement with the People's Republic of China remains strong. CGTN's Enoch Sekolia looks at how the two countries have cooperated on matters of health and peacekeeping.
Well, the relationship between China and South Sudan has been on several fronts, but the major areas have been health and peacekeeping. South Sudan, like the rest of the world, has been struggling to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. China has continued to play a key role in assisting the country battle the virus. China was the first country to send medical and financial aid to help South Sudan tackle the coronavirus pandemic. China's medical support for Africa's youngest country, however, began in 2013 and has since seen 8 medical teams so far deployed in the African country. The Chinese medics have provided medical consultations and surgeries to thousands of patients across South Sudan in the past 7 years. South Sudanese health sector remains one of the least developed in the world due to decades of conflict, including during the fight for independence and recent civil strife. But the continued cooperation between Chinese doctors and their South Sudanese colleagues in the past 8 years is helping strengthen the sector. In March this year, China and South Sudan signed a development pact for the expansion and modernization of the Juba Teaching Hospital to offer medical services to the East African country. The project sought to equip the facility with modern infectious disease division and several ICUs. On the peacekeeping front, China has continued to commit troops to the UN's peacekeeping mission in South Sudan, besides encouraging peace talks between warring groups. Stability in South Sudan is important for China, which has invested tens of millions of dollars and plenty of human resources to end the conflict. Of the 2,534 Chinese nationals now on UN missions, over 1,000 are in South Sudan. The peacekeepers have been in the African country to respond to conflicts and protect civilians.
A dozen suspects have been arrested, including Haitian Americans and retired members of the Colombian military. Many questions remain about why the president was assassinated in his home on Wednesday and by whom. The country's Senate has nominated its head, Joseph Lambert, as the country's interim president. Haiti has requested troops from the United Nations and the United States to help with security. With Laura Marincourt has more from Port-au-Prince.
20 people right now under arrest with the Haitian authorities. I believe they are still looking for new people who allegedly participated in these attacks against the residence of the president, and during this attack the president was killed. There is an interesting detail with regard to what the Haitian Americans they told the judge who heard the testimonies last Wednesday in the afternoon. What they said is practically they were there as translator. They were not inside. They did not enter the residence of the president. And the second detail that I think is very interesting is they say one of the Colombians who entered the house, this Colombian was part of the commando. This guy told these two Haitian American that the president was already dead when they got into the house. The Haitian government asked several foreign entities to help with this investigation, and the Colombians step in to provide help with regard to collaboration with Interpol, and I believe that they are providing right now details with regard to how these Colombians left the country, when they left the country, and they are providing details also about their identity. We believe that some of them, at least some of them, were retired officers in the army, and we hope to have more information probably in the next press conference of the government.
Record number of refugees and migrants are arriving in the UK this year, and the British government appears determined to try and stop them by introducing new legislation. Under the proposed changes, it will be a criminal offense to knowingly arrive in the UK without permission. The border force could be given power to turn away migrants at sea, and the government could also decide to process asylum claims outside the country. Nicole Johnston has more from London.
Every week, hundreds of asylum seekers board rubber dinghies in France to try and make it to the UK. So far this year, over 6,000 have reached England. Matt Coker takes tourists out for sport fishing trips. He sees dinghies with refugees and migrants almost every day, and he often films them.
We'll stay with you just to make sure you're okay, but we're not allowed to tow you or anything to the UK because the border force.
The dinghies they've been using this year, they have 30, 40, sometimes 50 people in. They're using much bigger dinghies. They're military-style dinghies with hard aluminium floors.
Now the British government is introducing legislation to crack down on what it regards as non-genuine refugees.
If you enter illegally from a safe country like France, where you should and could have claimed asylum, you are not seeking refuge from persecution, as is the intended purpose of the asylum system. Instead, you are choosing the UK as your preferred destination, and you are doing so at the expense of those with nowhere else to go.
But organisations which help refugees say the proposed bill could lead to offshore detention centres, similar to those used by Australia in places like the Pacific island of Nauru.
One of the reasons you could argue that they're being sent to these centres is so that they can be treated in a way that they might not get away with in this country. And as we've just said, the system in Australia has led to high levels of suicide and self-harm and lack of humanitarian protection.
This hotel near London's Heathrow Airport is home to 400 asylum seekers. There are more than 9,000 living in temporary accommodation across the UK.
One of the main reasons for this proposed new law is Brexit. The Leave campaign said it would take back control of the borders. But instead, since leaving the European Union, the UK hasn't been able to deport any migrants. And that's because so far, it has no reciprocal agreements with any other countries.
Matt Coker says the border force should be given the power to turn back boats.
You're being cruel to be kind, because if a boat full of 30, 40, 50 people gets run over by a ship in the English Channel, then it'll be, why has this happened? Well, the reason this has happened is because we've actually allowed it to happen.
But refugee supporters say it will take more than a change of law to stop it. Nicole Johnston, CGTN, London.
Time now for a short break. You're watching Africa Live. Here's what's ahead. Finance ministers from the Group of 20 meet in Venice to discuss a global minimum corporate tax rate. And France to begin closing its military bases in the southern Sahara and pulling 2,000 troops out of the Sahel.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis, Cairo, Juba, Johannesburg, Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Drowning at our beaches is very high. So this program, at the long-term objective, is to have a marine search and rescue squad that will be deployed to respond to emergencies as and when they happen.
You've got a group of people here who
are dedicated and are looking to do something good to improve their country, to make their beaches a little bit more safe and save some lives. And it takes that kind of dedication because this is a hard job.
As per last training we had, 120 people were trained. At the moment, we're looking at maybe 200 people trained. I think that is a good number to start with.
Welcome back to Africa Live. Thanks for staying with us. Tax reform is at the top of the agenda as finance ministers from the group of 20 meet in Venice. More than 100 countries agreed to a global minimum corporate tax rate of at least 15%. The world's biggest economies are trying to ensure huge multinational companies pay their fair share. Ryan Thompson reports from Frankfurt.
Well, the meeting of G20 finance ministers in Venice has wrapped up day one. All eyes were on this global tax plan, which was rolled out and discussed as an idea during the G7 summit in Cornwall just a little bit over a month ago. And in the days and weeks since that summit ended, it's really gone from an idea that was agreed to by those 7 powerful leaders to something that is ready for the world's economies to sign on for. The OECD in Paris has really guided taking this from a piece of an idea to a piece of policy that the world's economies can actually adopt. We've seen these OECD negotiations to be quite successful. 130 countries have signed on saying they are ready to go. And of course, this global tax reform to corporations will bring in over $100 billion that will be dispersed into the world's economies because there will be more fairer tax rules. It could happen as soon as 2023. But there are still some countries that are big holdouts here, notably 9 OECD countries. And that's what we expect these G20 ministers to try and hammer out over this weekend as they discuss economic policy. Because within Europe, for example, there are 3 countries who just are not ready to sign on to these rules. It includes Estonia, it includes Hungary, but perhaps the biggest one is Ireland. It's Europe's tech hub. So we're not exactly sure what comes out of this, but it's certain that these G20 ministers, all of whom and their countries have agreed to adapt this tax reform, will try to think about how to convince these hesitant countries and these countries that are firmly against it to really sign on to the policy to make this a global effort.
All right, let's bring in Edwin Nkoria, the Executive Director for Africa One campaign, to discuss the meeting in Italy. Edwin, welcome to Africa Live. The One campaign has expressed skepticism that there will be any major announcements from the G20 finance minister, especially on emergency issues. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, I think our biggest concern really is that in the middle of a pandemic, now that we're seeing the third wave, reaching its zenith in Africa, and while the rest of the richer countries are kind of moving on with most of their population already vaccinated, we're hoping that this will be an opportunity for the richest countries of the earth to begin to discuss how to end the pandemic. While conversations are already happening about talking about preparing for future pandemic or against future pandemics, the question is that what is happening right now? Why this should be like the hot topic for any gathering of the richest countries, particularly the resources needed to improve access to vaccines and to enhance recovery from the pandemic. So we were not expecting too much because, again, from the G7, the commitment in terms of doses didn't really, was not ambitious. But we are hoping that as G20 finance ministers meet, at least the idea or the agenda of ending this pandemic should top any kind of conversation right now. That's basically our reservation in terms of this meeting that is happening.
All right. So, Edwin, what are the key issues that the G20 should focus on to avoid repeating the mistakes that have hampered the global response to COVID-19?
I think that one of the first is to understand that the fiscal spaces for most African countries, most low-income countries, has been really, really affected by the global supply chain that was disrupted, during this pandemic. The question is, how do we mobilize the resources? How do we mobilize a global plan to end the pandemic? So we thought that should be like a top of the agenda. How do we mobilize the the funds necessary to improve, one, not just ending the pandemic, access to vaccine, but also bouncing back in terms of, creating the jobs that have been lost, rebuilding back the economies, and then, of course, climate change. So we are hoping that this will top the agenda. But of course, like you already talked about previously, the global tax, minimum tax, is one of the key agreements that we see here. While that is good in the long term, the question is, what are we doing right now to end this pandemic, especially when the finance ministers of the richest country come together at the G20?
All right, speaking of what we're doing now, there are also calls for the G20 to ensure the work on pandemic preparedness does not distract world leaders from tackling the current crisis. Can you give us more details on that as well?
Yes. There was a report, the high-level political forum that is giving a report on resourcing pandemic preparedness. Now, the question really is that when you're going to bring out such a report, which is great, which is good to look to the future on how to plan against, the future pandemics, the question right now is, who is going to trust you to do that? When the poorest countries right now have basically been told you are on your own. So how are you going to mobilize the whole world, even against preparing for future pandemics? So that announcement is made. That report has come through, through the committee that has been set up. It was announced yesterday. The question now is that how do you mobilize others to come behind that? How do you get them to stand with you? Talking about a global effort, because currently the poorest countries are not, receiving a global solidarity. So that's the biggest concern we are having, and we are hoping that as you're preparing for the future, when the house is on fire, you cannot be talking about a sprinkler system that is going to, make your grass green in the future. So we hope to put out the fire, and we hope that that is going to be the toughest, the top discussion even for the G20 finance ministers.
Edward Okoria, thank you so much for your perspective on this. Much appreciated. In other news, France is to begin closing its military bases in the southern Sahara region and is pulling 2,000 troops out as it starts drawing down its military operation in the Sahel. French President Emmanuel Macron revealed this after the latest G5 Sahel summit. The summit marked the first meeting of the 5 African leaders and the French president since the announcement of the end of the French mission in the region. Russ Cullen reports.
The French president said that France will begin reconfiguring its military presence in the Sahel region of West Africa in the coming weeks. Emmanuel Macron announced a month ago that France was ending its Operation Barkhane mission and would, in the future, operate within a broader international alliance. This was his first official gathering with the G5 Sahel nations of Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger and Chad since the 10th of June announcement of the drawing down of French forces battling armed groups in the troubled Sahel region of Africa. The French military mission has been in place since 2014 with 2 aims: to dismantle and disrupt the Al-Qaeda and Daesh-affiliated groups operating in the vast, loosely governed spaces of the southern Sahara, and also to bolster and train the regional armies. Now that mission is coming to an end after the deaths of more than 50 French troops, hundreds of local soldiers and civilians, and the displacement of thousands more.
La stabilisation de la zone des trois.
The stabilisation of the Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger border zone and the ebbing of the terrorist grip on this region opens us up to the possibility of implementing, without further delay, the reconfiguration of our presence, according to terms and conditions set up with our partners and Sahel allies.
This was the first meeting of the leaders since the coup in Mali in May. The military officer who led that takeover of the government was also behind another coup in Mali last August. Colonel Assimi Goïta was attending the Friday summit after being installed as the transitional president in Mali. This was also the first time the presidents have met since the death of the former Chadian leader Idriss Déby in April from wounds sustained on the battlefield. Déby's son, Mahamat Idriss Déby, the 37-year-old general who is the acting president and head of the Transitional Military Council in Chad, was also in attendance at the G5 summit. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
Earlier, we spoke to our correspondent Deji Badmus in Lagos, Nigeria, on the fast-changing political security environment in the Sahel. Let's take a listen.
There's just no way the G5 as a body now would be able to deal with this. And then as a security force, the G5 Sahel force would definitely not be able to deal with the challenging security situation in the Sahel. And that is why everyone is worried that France has decided that it's going to cut down on its troops in the Sahel. Of course, there is another force that is coming. That's the Takuba force. But not everyone is confident that that broader alliance of European Union forces now would be able to deal with the security challenge. Well, as you're aware, Burkina Faso is currently facing, I mean, just last week we had a series of public protests, quite widespread public protests now against the government. People in both countries are actually dissatisfied. The protests we saw in Burkina Faso last week, essentially the protesters asking the government to do more to secure the country, and of course triggered by the series of attacks we have seen. Remember the attack we saw there sometime in June, where about 160 persons were killed, one of the worst attacks that country has suffered. So France is no doubt very crucial to the stability of the region, stability in both countries. And France has been playing a very important role, even though sometime not quite long ago we saw the citizens of this country is now complaining that despite the presence of French forces, attacks continue to happen. But the truth is that, look, without the presence of these French forces, things might have even gotten worse. But, you know, it's a very terrible situation for both countries, not just both countries now, Burkina Faso and Mali, but for the entire region. And it's a reason everyone is concerned, because the spillover effect this could have, if jihadis continue to run amok in this region, the spillover effect it could have on the continent, especially the West African sub-region, can be best imagined.
Don't go away. We've got your business segment coming up next. Here's a look at the headlines. Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation signs an agreement to acquire 20% of upcoming Dangote refinery. Ethiopia plans to restructure $1 billion debt to boost recovery efforts after COVID-19.
This has taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
Welcome back to Africa Live. Let's start with Africa's biggest oil producer. The state-owned Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation says it has signed an agreement to acquire a 20% stake in a $19.5 billion Dangote refinery, which is currently under construction in Lagos. The refinery is expected to commence operations next year. As designed, it can process 650,000 barrels of crude per day. With the details, here's CGTN's Deji Badmus.
The NNPC has not disclosed exactly how much the 20% stake it plans to acquire in the 19 billion Dangote refinery would cost, but says it would be worth every penny put into the deal. It also says the borrowing would be on the back of its cash flow on its investments in the refinery, but some analysts have concerns.
I've not seen the repayment schedule for that loan. I have not seen the projections of dividend income from that investment as be able to juxtapose the possibility that the investment will be able to pay back the loan. If the investment will not be able to pay back the loan, then it becomes a problem because it simply means that the government has to look for funding from other sources to pay back that loan. But if it's an investment that is based on sound analysis, and clearly we could see appreciation in the value of the investment, we could see cash flow from dividend payment, and then added to the issue of energy security, then one can understand that.
Besides the issue of profit, the NNPC says its decision to acquire 20% stake in the refinery is based on government policy of acquiring equity stakes in any private refinery with a capacity in excess of 50,000 barrels a day for energy security. The Dangote refinery has the capacity to refine 650,000 barrels of oil per day.
It's very important for the federal government to do what they're doing. I really am fully support it because it's such a strategic investment. We don't want that investment to fail. If you look at the magnitude of it, and if Dangote had to take those horrendous risks just because he had faith in this country, we shouldn't allow his project to fail. So it's very important that the government has stake in it, just to help it stay alive and then to help deal with some of the issues that may arise in the future.
Now, it's not just the NNPC that is eyeing a stake in the Dangote refinery. One of the major petroleum marketing bodies in this country, the Independent Petroleum Marketers Association of Nigeria, says it's in talks with Dangote to acquire a 5% stake in the refinery. So we're likely to see more investors show interest in the refinery in the future, especially when it begins operations next year. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Nigeria's commercial nerve center, Lagos, dropped 22 places to rank 93rd in the 2021 Global FinTech rankings. While Lagos slumped in the report, Kenya's capital, Nairobi, jumped 26 places to rank 37th. According to the report, it's the only African city in the top 50 category of cities around the globe. Accra, Ghana's capital, dropped 28 places to rank 151st on the global rankings of cities. Meanwhile, the recently released Global Startup Ecosystem Index 2021 shows that Nairobi replaced Lagos as Africa's top startup center. Within the year, over 50 new cities and 20 new countries were added to the index, meaning that they host the headquarters of at least 10 privately owned fintech companies. Among the 83 countries in the index, Nigeria dropped 5 places to rank 57th, behind Kenya, which moved 11 places upward to rank 31st. Africa's largest economy also ranked behind South Africa, which dropped 7 places to rank 44th. Zimbabwe's central bank has released a new 50 Zimbabwean dollar note into circulation, and that's the highest denomination for the reintroduced currency, and it aims to ease transactions in an economy that has been struggling with triple-digit inflation. CGTN's Brian Wakatuya has the details from Harare.
People are yet to see the new banknotes, but aren't short of opinion on how they will impact them. The central bank says the $50 note will enhance transaction convenience. However, some are concerned the new tender could have unintended consequences.
Transport fares were recently raised to $120, but I foresee them going up to $150 now, so that there are no challenges of change.
We used to have coins and 2 $5 notes, but they're no longer in circulation since higher denominations were introduced. So this $50 note simply means the phasing out of the $10 note.
But analysts have downplayed the fears.
Our economy has been very speculative, and we have got some rent seekers and arbitrary goers in our economy. The expectation is always that prices are going to go up, which I think from the measures that have been put up by Reserve Bank, we don't expect any increase in the prices. And even the functionality of the auction system, I think, will also help defend any price increase because it becomes unreasonable.
The central bank has punished companies that get money on the foreign currency auction at the official rate but price their goods using the parallel market rate. It's also adjusted its quarterly reserve money growth targets from 22.5% to 20% in order to maintain a downward trajectory on inflation.
Even at the target of 22.5% reserve money growth, we are significantly lower in the first quarter of 2021. At a time we expected the reserve money growth was going to be higher. We have done significantly well to contain it in the regions of around 10%.
Analysts expect the monetary expansion to be held below the new target in the next quarter, which will help bring inflation down to the year-end target of 25%. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Let's turn our attention to Ethiopia. The government has started the process of restructuring an additional $1 billion of public debt as it seeks to free up more funds to support its economic recovery amid the global COVID-19 pandemic. The restructuring plan, however, does not include Eurobonds. The Finance Ministry says the restructuring will provide a grace period of 6 years and extend the maturity by 10 years. Currently, $2.5 billion in principal and interest payments has been postponed for 5 years by commercial creditors under the first external debt restructuring scheme. The announcement comes after Ethiopia requested to rework its debt under the G20 Common Framework. The United States has added more than a dozen Chinese firms to its blacklist of companies that are off limits to American investors. It stems over alleged human rights violations in China's Xinjiang region. Beijing has slammed the move, accusing Washington of exploiting the issue to dominate global supply. Now, CGTN's Zhao Yunfei reports.
The administration of U.S. President Joe Biden added another 34 entities to its blacklist on Friday. Among them, 14 of the companies are Chinese. They are accused of using technology to help surveil ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. A spokesperson for the Uyghur Autonomous Region says human rights are protected there.
The rights of workers of all ethnic groups are protected by law. The law details remuneration, vacation benefits, safety, and social insurance. Meanwhile, workers' rights and religion, culture, and language are also respected in Xinjiang.
The U.S. alleges forced labor in Xinjiang's cotton farming industry. China denies the claim, citing data showing the mechanization rate for harvesting cotton in northern Xinjiang has surpassed 90%. In the south, it's 70%. The entity list restricts companies from having a trade relationship with the U.S. China says the move is another example of power politics aimed at maintaining its status in the global industry chain.
The so-called entity list of the U.S. is in essence a tool for suppressing specific companies and industries in China under the pretext of human rights. The U.S. uses it to destabilize Xinjiang and contain China. China firmly opposes this and will take all necessary measures to resolutely safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese companies and foil U.S. attempts to interfere in China's internal affairs.
As China vows to protect the rights of its companies, officials say they will continue to develop and improve supply chains within the country. Zhao Yunfei, CGTN, Beijing.
A Canadian judge has denied a request to add a trove of documents to the extradition case of Huawei's chief financial officer Meng Wanzhou's lawyers wanted hundreds of pages of bank documents entered into evidence that she said would undermine the fraud charges against her. But the judge disagreed. Huawei says it respects the ruling, but regrets the outcome. Meng is facing extradition to the United States for allegedly misleading HSBC about Huawei's business dealings in Iran. She's set to appear in court next month after being under house arrest in Canada since 2018. The news continues on Africa Live. Here's a look at what's ahead. Uganda health experts raise concern over long-term effects of COVID-19 on mental health.
Join us in Global Business and see Africa through our eyes.
The greatest journeys,
The greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Kanata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Africa Live. We certainly appreciate your company. In Uganda, psychiatrists are concerned about an increasing number of mental health patients being treated after battling COVID-19. They say the long-term effects of COVID-19 are leaving many patients suffering from depression, anxiety, and stress. CGTN's Hilary Ayesega has more details on this story.
Breathing, but now take in all the noises.
Relaxing her mind, Belinda Tim is gradually recovering from the effects of COVID-19. She says the fear of dying from COVID-19 and the cost of her care have affected her mentally.
It was mentally torturing in the night, and my heart palpitations started to increase, and I started to feel very sick, and that already was exacerbating the other symptoms that I was already having.
And place your left hand.
Belinda suffers from an anxiety disorder, and now with the effects of COVID-19, she decided to seek the services of a psychiatrist who recommended yoga as a therapy. Belinda says consistent yoga workouts like this one helps her improve her mental health, and she hopes to overcome the anxiety attacks triggered by the effects of COVID-19. Little data exists on the pandemic effects on mental health in Uganda, but specialists say they are seeing an increasing number of patients treated after battling COVID-19.
We have seen that COVID patients, most of them have not been cancelled before testing, and there has also not been counseling after they received their results. This has impacted definitely their mental health. How? It has caused fear, panic, because we have lost so many people to COVID.
Mental health specialists say social stigma is also on the rise.
There is anxiety of after you have tested, how do you relay this information that I have tested actually positive? So there's a lot of things going on, like also social stigma. You find that someone is in a family, someone is in an organization, but they can't actually declare that they tested positive.
Psychiatrists are now encouraging people who have suffered from COVID-19 to seek counseling services. For Belinda, practicing yoga daily seems to be the answer to her mental health problems. Hilary Ayesega, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
One of South Africa's main hospitals is slowly being brought back to life. The facility was evacuated and operations were halted for 2 months after a storeroom fire. Charlotte Maxeke is one of the biggest government health facilities offering specialized care. It was also one of the main COVID-19 treatment centers. CGTN's Julie Shire reports.
The closure of one of South Africa's biggest hospitals, Charlotte Maxeke, couldn't have come at a worse time. The country is on the cusp of a third COVID-19 wave, with health facilities on the back foot. An initial 7-day closure following a fire dragged on for more than 2 months.
Because the facility was 100% evacuated and left vacant, we needed the municipality to give us the go-ahead to reoccupy. That's when we really got into the nitty-gritties of understanding that the building is not fully compliant to the current day fire standards in particular, and the national building standards in general.
Charlotte Maxeke has been in operation since 1979. It serves as a teaching hospital and offers highly specialized services, including an oncology unit. 160 cancer patients were among hundreds evacuated.
The Radiation Oncology Department in Charlotte is the only state radiation oncology department in Johannesburg. The only other one in Gauteng is at Steve Biko Academic Hospital in Pretoria. Now, Steve Biko doesn't have a lot of excess capacity, so it is impossible to accommodate all our patients that we had on treatment here at once at Steve Biko.
The oncology department has since been the first to be reopened, much to the relief of doctors and anxious patients.
When radiation treatment is started, it's planned to be started and completed over a specific time frame. Now, sometimes patients get sick or they might develop COVID in the middle of treatment and have to stop treatment, etc. So the radiation oncologists are able to compensate for that, but it's not ideal.
The hospital is one of the main COVID-19 treatment centers and has started readmitting patients.
In terms of COVID patients, they have occupied the high care and the ICU units, which have got 177 and 276 bed spaces respectively. They've also occupied the maternal area, and then they've also identified other areas that need to be opened up in both the rest of the COVID care facility as well as critical care units.
Since the fire at Charlotte Makeke, over 30 other Gauteng state hospitals have come under scrutiny. The province is at the epicenter of a relentless third wave of infections and cannot afford to lose capacity. But occupational health safety standards at most facilities have been found to be below par and need to be addressed urgently. Julie Shara, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
And we are not done just yet. We've got your sports news coming up in just a moment. Here's a peek at the headline. Olympic organizers issue a rallying call ahead of the opening ceremony.